Hello everyone, you are on the channel, The Middle Ages. When we think of the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Knights in shining armor, magnificent castles, and glorious battles. But what about the people who made all of that possible? The vast majority of the population who lived and died without ever seeing a crown or holding a sword. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the romanticized tales and diving deep into the harsh, gritty reality of the life of a serf. Forget what you've seen in the movies. This is the real story of the backbone of medieval society. So what exactly was a serf? Were they just slaves? Not quite, but it was close. Serfdom was a condition of bondage that developed during the High Middle Ages in Europe. A serf wasn't owned by a person like a slave was. Instead, they were tied to the land. They couldn't leave the manor they were born on without the lord's permission, which was rarely given. They were part of the property, just like the fields, the forest, and the mill. If the land was sold or granted to a new lord, the serfs went with it. They were a permanent fixture, an inherited labor force, bound by law and tradition. This system, known as manorialism, was the economic engine of feudalism. The lord provided protection and a small plot of land, and in return, the serf provided labor, a lot of labor. Let's imagine a day in the life of a serf named John, around the year 1200. His day wouldn't start with the sound of an alarm clock, but with the first light of dawn, or even before. His home, a 1 or 2 room hut, would be dark and smoky. These huts were usually made of wattle and daub, a mix of woven lattice, mud, straw, and animal dung. The floor would be packed earth, maybe with some straw thrown on it for warmth. There was no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters that were closed at night to keep out the cold and, hopefully, intruders. In the center of the main room, a small fire would be burning for cooking and warmth. But without a chimney, the smoke would fill the hut before escaping through a hole in the thatched roof. And John wouldn't be living alone. He'd share this small space with his wife, his children, and often their livestock during the cold winter months. Yes, you heard that right. The family pig or a few chickens might be snuggled up in the corner to protect them from the cold and from being stolen. Breakfast, if he was lucky, would be a piece of coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley and maybe some watery ale. Forget your fancy avocado toast. Wheat bread was a luxury reserved for the Lord. After this meager meal, John's workday began, and it was long. From sunup to sundown, his life was dictated by the agricultural calendar. The serf's primary duty was to work the Lord's land, called the demesne. Typically, this meant working 3 days a week on the Lord's fields, plowing, planting, weeding, and harvesting. This work was unpaid. It was the rent he paid for his own small strip of land. On top of that, there were boon days, extra days of work required during busy times like the harvest, where every able-bodied person, including women and older children, had to help. The work was backbreaking. The plows were heavy, often made of wood, and had to be guided by hand, pulled by a team of oxen that the serfs might have to pool together to afford. Harvesting was done with a sickle or a scythe, swinging it hour after hour under the hot sun. There were no weekends, no paid time off, no retirement plan. The only breaks were religious holidays, the holy days, which were a welcome respite from the relentless toil. These were times for church services, but also for feasting, drinking, and community gatherings, precious moments of joy in a life of hardship. After working the Lord's land, John still had his own to tend to. The family's survival depended on the crops they could grow on their own small plot. These were usually divided into strips scattered across the manor's fields. This strip farming system was meant to ensure everyone got a mix of good and poor land, but it was incredibly inefficient, involving a lot of walking back and forth. Everything they grew on this land, barley, oats, peas, beans, had to feed their family for the entire year, as well as provide seed for the next. A bad harvest could mean starvation, and it wasn't just farming. John had other obligations. He had to maintain roads, build fences, and dig ditches on the manor. His wife, meanwhile, was just as busy. She tended the vegetable garden, looked after the children, cooked the meals, brewed ale, spun wool into thread, and wove cloth to make the family's clothes. Her work never ended. Now let's talk about the food. The diet of a serf was monotonous and barely adequate. The main staple was pottage, a thick soup or stew of vegetables, grains, and whatever else was available. It would be kept on the fire all day with new ingredients added as they came to hand. Meat was a rare luxury. While the forests were full of game like deer and wild boar, they belonged to the Lord. A serf caught poaching could face severe punishment, from fines to mutilation or even death. The family might raise a pig, but it was often too valuable to eat, sold at the market for precious cash. They might have chickens for eggs and a cow for milk if they were fortunate. For the most part, their protein came from cheese, eggs, and legumes. Water was often unclean, so most people, including children, drank small beer or weak ale, which was safer due to the brewing process. Life was not only hard, it was also precarious. Serfs were at the bottom of the social ladder, with very few rights. They couldn't marry or have their children marry someone from another manor without the Lord's permission and usually a fee. If a serf wanted to send his son to be educated by the church, he needed the Lord's consent. When a serf died, his family had to pay an inheritance tax, called a heriot, to the Lord. This was often their best animal. On top of all this were the fees. Want to grind your grain into flour? You had to use the Lord's mill and pay a fee. Want to bake your bread? You had to use the Lord's oven and pay a fee. Want to press your grapes or apples? You guessed it, the Lord's press for a fee. It was a system designed to extract as much wealth as possible from the peasantry and funnel it upwards. So, was there any escape? For most, the answer was no. Serfdom was a hereditary condition. If your parents were serfs, you were a serf. However, there were a few ways out. A serf could be freed by their lord, an act called manumission, but this was rare. A more common path was to run away. If a serf could escape to a town and live there for a year and a day without being caught, they were legally free. This gave rise to the German saying, Stadtluft macht frei, meaning city air makes you free. But this was a risky gamble. If caught, the punishment would be severe. Over time, particularly after the Black Death in the mid-14th century, the system began to change. The plague wiped out a huge portion of the population, leading to a severe labor shortage. Suddenly, serfs had bargaining power. They could demand better conditions and higher wages. Many lords, desperate for workers, began to commute labor services into cash rents. This was the beginning of the end for serfdom in Western Europe. Though it lingered in Eastern Europe for centuries longer, the life of a medieval serf was one of constant labor, obligation, and uncertainty. They lived and died in a world defined by the seasons and the demands of their lord. They were not glorious knights or powerful kings, but their tireless work was the foundation upon which the entire medieval world was built. Their resilience in the face of incredible hardship is a testament to the human spirit. So next time you see a picture of a grand medieval castle, take a moment to remember the thousands of forgotten people, the serfs, whose sweat and toil made it all possible. Their story is just as important, and just as much a part of history. Thanks for joining us on this journey back in time. If you found this glimpse into the life of a serf interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Middle Ages for more deep dives into this fascinating era. Let us know in the comments what part of medieval life you'd like us to explore next. See you in the next video.